say something really stupid because it's a criticism of Kierkegaard, and that's ridiculous because I'm not worthy of carrying his sandals or tying his sandals, however the saying goes. But I think that he has gotten bogged down at this point in this part two. And maybe that's inevitable that he gets bogged down. And what I mean bogged down in his exposition, in his philosophical description of what's going on in the journey of spirit. And perhaps that's because, again, of the nature of the subject matter, which is Christian subject matter. And he says repeatedly, and I hope that it doesn't offend the Christians amongst us, that Christianity is absurd and paradoxical. That anyone who tries to defend Christianity, he says, is stupid. First of all, that Christianity doesn't need defense. It's not some, as he says, some miserable object in need of defense. And goes on to say that anything that needs, nothing good, nothing, he says to defend something is always to discredit it. That is, to defend something is to say that it needs to imply that it needs to be defended, and that discredits it. Christianity doesn't need to be defended. It's just stupid to think it needs to be defended for him. But we are faced with a number of difficult issues. And how couldn't we be? We're talking about things like sin and faith, which are, in any religious tradition, kinds of mysteries. But what is the biggest mystery or paradox we're at right now? I would say, even given what the last talk focused on, this story of the day laborer who could not, or perhaps could not, accept the absurdity of the invitation to marry the emperor's daughter, being a metaphor for our own individual, each one of us, our own reluctance to accept the absurdity of God's attention to us. That did something to point out some of the roadblocks to getting out of despair, which is basically being willing to relate to God just as the person that you are. It doesn't really, explain how we get to that point, and perhaps couldn't, because what it says at that point is that we must have faith, and faith is by definition something that cannot be justified by any rational means. And it is at this point that he really contrasts his own Christian viewpoint and his own view of the self with the Platonic one, I think, and this is the significance of this whole discussion of the Socratic definition of sin, which begins on page 120. The philosophical explanations of human beings and human natures are neater. They tie up loose ends, and they are complete and justified in a way that the Christian account of the self, of being a human person, couldn't be. And the Socratic view of sin is an example of that. Why do we sin? Essentially, that the reason that we sin is because of ignorance. That is, very famously, Socrates thought that everyone did the good, at least that everyone did what seemed good to them. That it would make no sense to willingly do something bad. That if people do bad things, it's because bad things appear to be good to them. So the Socratic mission then is to help people see what is truly good, so that they will, and that they will automatically then do it. But that no one would do evil willingly, and there are different explanations of that or defenses of that position within Plato's dialogues. Kierkegaard's point is that if you accept the Socratic definition of sin, then sin just goes away. Then there's no such thing as sin. He says at the bottom of page 121, last paragraph, therefore Socrates does not really come to the category of sin, which is without a doubt a defect in a definition of sin. How so? Well, if sin is ignorance, then sin does not really exist, for sin is precisely consciousness. If sin is ignorance of what is right, and one then does what is wrong because one does not know what is right, no sin has occurred. If that is to be sin, then it is assumed, as Socrates also assumed, that there cannot be a case of someone's doing the wrong thing knowing what is the right thing, or doing the wrong thing knowing it to be wrong, which is necessary for sin. That is, for Kierkegaard's view of sin, we must be doing the wrong thing knowing that it's the wrong thing. This just doesn't fit into the Socratic or Platonic or overall Greek view of human action and human nature. But it is the very essence of what Kierkegaard views is true about us. And maybe this is a point where we should also mention that one of the implications of the Kierkegaardian definition of sin, what he would call the Christian definition of sin, is that sin is reserved for the Christian, and perhaps the Jew and the Muslim too, if we take those indications that anybody aware of that God is in the same position or a similar position. That sin requires, for Kierkegaard, since sin is disobedience to God, sin requires an awareness of God, or awareness of being in the presence of God, and an awareness that one's task is to do that which God wants, rather than to do the good. That this, this consciousness, if it is, let's say, that is reserved to the Christian, or, again, maybe a larger view of things that would include Judaism and Islam, but it's more or less this awareness of God is reserved to the Christian, then only the Christian can really sin. If you're not aware of God, as the whole pagan world, these splendid vices that Kierkegaard refers to, the whole pagan world and the whole non-Christian world, is to say the whole non-Abrahamic religion world, and Judaism, Christianity, Islam, is unaware of God, then strictly speaking it can't sin, at least not in the fullest respect. So sin becomes something reserved for the person who's aware of what sin is, which is disobedience, defiance of God. But again, so the Socratic definition of sin makes sense. The Christian one doesn't, because it doesn't fully explain, why is it that we sin? Why do we sin against God? Socrates explains sin. Well, we sin because we're ignorant. That is, we do bad things because we're ignorant of what the good is. If we knew what the good was, we would do good things. That makes sense, I think. The Christian view, that is, which seems to be Kierkegaard's view, I should say, that we go on this journey of the self, which is an intensification of despair, an intensification of consciousness of self, and an intensification of one's consciousness of being in the presence of God, that when we get to the most despairing point, we sin. As he says at the bottom of page 112, top of page 113 again, only when a self, as this particular individual, is conscious of being before God, only then is it the infinite self, and that self then sins before God. There's no explanation of why that self then sins before God. There is an assumption. That's just what happens. So, why do we sin? We just do, I guess. But why is the self sinful? Well, not because of its lower nature overcoming it. Kierkegaard has dismissed that explanation because, after all, sin is a category of spirit or self. The self is freedom, so everything that the self does, it does freely out of its own free will. Nothing just happens to the self. The self does things which it therefore is fully responsible for. Now, why does the self choose to sin? We're kind of left hanging at the end of this book, and that's okay, given that faith is what is required of the despairer at this most intense level of despair. I don't see how it could be any other ways. But let's have one more video and sort of look over the journey of the self that's described in Kierkegaard's Sickness Unto